Not in theory, not eventually. Now, right now, this weekend. And the way it happened, the actual story behind how this executive order came to exist in the first place, is one of the most remarkable things I have personally seen come out of Washington in a very long time. We are talking about a text message, a response that came back within minutes, and a decision that broke through 56 years of entrenched government red tape in the time it takes most career bureaucrats to finish their morning coffee and start their slow commute into the office. If you care about veterans, if you care about mental health in this country, if you care about what government is actually supposed to do for the people it serves and the people who sacrificed for it, you need to hear the story from beginning to end without skipping a single part. Because what just happened in Washington is genuinely historic in every meaningful sense of that word. And the people who stood in that room, let us start with the numbers, because the numbers are the reason any of this matters, and the reason this should have happened years ago. Right now, more than 14 million American adults live with serious mental illness that substantially interferes with their ability to live a normal daily life. 14 million people. 8 million of those people are already on prescription medication, many of them cycling through treatment after treatment that does not work, does not stick, and leaves them right back exactly where they started after months or years of trying. But the group that has been hit the hardest, the group that this executive order specifically and deliberately targets with real urgency and real resources, is America's veterans. More than 6,000 veterans die by suicide every single year. That number has been consistent, devastatingly consistent, for more than 2 decades. 2 full decades of the same tragedy repeating itself year after year, while the system that was supposed to help these men and women kept offering the same key solutions that were already proven not to be working. Suicide rates among veterans are more than twice as high as among the non-veteran population. Let that sit for a moment. The people who sacrificed the most for this country, who saw the things most of us will never see and did the things most of us will never be asked to do, are dying at twice the rate of everyone else when they come home. That is not a statistic you note and move on from. That is a national emergency that demands urgent action. And for far too long, Washington treated it like a line item in a budget report instead of the crisis it actually is and has always been. Now here is where the story gets remarkable, because the breakthrough that finally got Washington to act did not come from a committee hearing. It did not come from a policy working group or a task force or panel of experts convening over several years to produce a report that nobody reads. It came from a text message. Joe Rogan, one of the most listened to voices in America, sent President Trump information about a compound called ibogaine. Ibogaine is a psychedelic substance that has been studied for its extraordinary effects on addiction and trauma. The data that Rogan sent was not speculation. It was not anecdotal evidence from internet forums. It was real clinical research showing something that should have stopped every policymaker in Washington cold. With 1 dose of ibogaine, more than 80% of people are free of opiate addiction. With 2 doses, that number rises above 90%. Let that land for a second. 90%. In a country where more than 5 million people are currently addicted to opiates, and where more than 80,000 people died of overdoses in 2024 alone, a treatment exists that removes addiction in 90% of cases with 2 doses, and it has been illegal to prescribe or administer in the United States because of a law passed in 1970. The text message went out. The response came back. Sounds great. Do you want FDA approval? Let's do it. That fast, that direct, that decisive. Joe Rogan described the moment himself, standing right there in the room, and the way he told it says everything about why this moment is different from every other time Washington has made promises about helping veterans and then quietly done nothing meaningful about it afterward. He said, "I sent him that information. The text message came back. Sounds great. Do you want FDA approval? Let's do it." It was literally that quick. For 56 years, we lived under those terrible conditions. We are free of that now. We are free of that now thanks to all these people that you see next to me and thanks to President Trump. That is not the careful, hedged language of a prepared press release crafted by a communications team over several days. That is the raw, unfiltered language of someone who has watched people he genuinely cares about suffer for years while the system failed them over and over again, and who finally got to stand in a room and watch something real actually change in real time. And the speed of the response matters enormously. Because speed in government, genuine decisive speed that cuts through red tape and delivers a real result rather than another promise of future action, is exactly what the veterans fighting through PTSD and addiction and suicidal ideation every single day desperately needed to see coming from Washington. Not another timeline stretched across another committee cycle. Not another task force report. Action. Direct. Fast. Real. Now, let us talk about why ibogaine specifically has been illegal for 56 years. because this is the part of the story that makes the whole situation even more enraging once you understand it clearly and completely. Ibogaine did not become a controlled substance because research showed it was dangerous to patients. It did not become illegal because clinical trials produced alarming safety signals, or because doctors across the country raised widespread medical concerns about what was happening to people who used it. It became illegal because of the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which was signed into law by the Nixon administration under circumstances that had nothing whatsoever to do with public health or scientific evidence. And the historical record on why Nixon pursued that legislation is not speculation, not a fringe theory, and not a conspiracy. His own senior advisors have stated clearly in recorded interviews that the legislation was designed specifically to target the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement by criminalizing the substances most associated with those political communities at that particular moment in American history. Ibogaine was swept into the same net, not because any doctor or researcher showed it caused harm, because it was associated with communities that the Nixon administration wanted to suppress and disrupt. That is the actual reason ibogaine has been illegal. That is the actual reason veterans suffering from the worst PTSD imaginable and the most severe addiction have been denied access to one of the most promising and well-documented therapeutic compounds ever studied. Not science, not medicine. Political calculation from more than half a century ago. Until now, until this weekend. Until this executive order changed it. What the executive order actually does is worth breaking down carefully, because there is a lot in it, and all of it matters. First, it directs the FDA to fast-track priority reviews for drugs that have already been granted breakthrough therapy designation. Breakthrough therapy designation is not given lightly. It means the FDA itself has already looked at the preliminary evidence and determined that a drug shows substantial improvement over existing therapies for a serious condition. Ibogaine has that designation. MDMA-assisted therapy has that designation. These are not fringe compounds being pushed through without scrutiny. They are compounds that have already cleared an important scientific hurdle and have been waiting in the queue for years while the bureaucratic machinery ground forward at its usual pace. The executive order says that wait is over. Second, the order opens right-to-try pathways for investigational compounds. Right to try is a principle that says when someone has a serious condition and existing treatments have failed them, they should have the legal right to try investigational treatments that have shown promise, even if those treatments have not yet completed the full FDA approval process. Trump signed the original Right to Try Act during his first term. This executive order extends that principle specifically into the psychedelic therapy space, meaning that veterans and other patients with treatment-resistant conditions do not have to wait for the full approval process to complete before they can access treatments that might save their lives. That is not a small thing. For someone fighting PTSD and addiction right now, today, that pathway is the difference between help and nothing. Third, the order commits $50 million in matching funds for state psychedelic research programs. $50 million is real money. It is not symbolic. It is the kind of investment that builds research infrastructure, funds clinical trials, generates evidence, and creates the data pipeline that allows regulators to make faster and better decisions. The matching component is smart policy because it incentivizes states to put their own resources into this research rather than simply waiting for federal funding to arrive. It multiplies the impact and creates a network of research programs across the country rather than concentrating everything in one place. And the data those programs generate feeds directly back into the approval and regulatory process, creating a cycle of evidence generation that accelerates the entire pathway from research to treatment. Fourth, the order requires collaboration between health and human services, the FDA and the VA. If you have ever watched government agencies operate, you know that getting them to work together consistently and effectively is genuinely one of the hardest things in Washington. Each agency has its own priorities, its own budget cycles, its own institutional culture, and its own incentives that do not always align with what other agencies are doing. This order does not just encourage collaboration, it requires it. It orders these agencies to work together to speed up clinical trials, share evidence, coordinate on veteran-specific programs, and report on progress. That kind of mandatory coordination backed by an executive order is how you actually break down the silos that have kept promising treatments from reaching patients for years. Fifth, the order requires the Attorney General to review rescheduling once Phase 3 trials finish. This is the long game built into the legislation. Phase 3 trials are the final clinical trial stage before a drug can be approved for widespread medical use. By requiring the Attorney General to review rescheduling at that point, the order creates an automatic trigger for the legal reclassification of these compounds, from controlled substances to therapeutic drugs, once the science supports it. It does not leave rescheduling to chance or to the political climate of a future administration. It builds the rescheduling review into the regulatory process as a required step that has to happen when the evidence reaches a defined threshold. That is how you create durable policy change, rather than just a moment that can be easily reversed. Now let us talk about the man who stood in that room and looked the president in the eye and said, "You are going to save a lot of lives through this." Because his presence at that signing ceremony is something that no amount of policy language or executive order text can fully capture or adequately replace. Marcus Luttrell is a retired Navy SEAL. He is the lone survivor of Operation Red Wings in Afghanistan in 2005, a mission that cost the lives of 3 of his closest teammates and 19 Special Operations forces in the rescue attempt that followed those initial losses. His story became the book and eventually the major film Lone Survivor. The things Marcus Luttrell has seen on that mountain and in that valley, the losses he has carried every single day since, the physical and psychological weight of what he survived and what he was forced to witness his brothers not survive, represent a level of trauma that most people cannot begin to approach in their imagination. There is no framework most of us have for it. And Marcus Luttrell has publicly and courageously credited ibogaine therapy with saving his life after service. He has spoken openly and in detail about severe PTSD and addiction that followed his return from Afghanistan, and about how conventional treatments, the medications and the therapy sessions and the standard pathways the VA offered failed consistently to address what he was actually going through at the deepest level. And then ibogaine changed everything. Not gradually, not partially, everything. When a man with that history and that earned authority stand in the Oval Office and tells the president directly that a treatment saved his life, and that the executive order being signed will save the lives of thousands more Americans who are suffering right now the way he suffered, that is not a celebrity appearance. That is not a photo opportunity. That is testimony from someone who went to the absolute edge and came back, and who knows from personal experience what coming back actually required. The president heard it and acted on it the same day. The push to get psychedelic therapy recognized as legitimate treatment for veterans and for Americans suffering from addiction and mental illness has been building for years. The names behind that push are not random. Joe Rogan has used his platform, one of the largest in the world, to give serious airtime to researchers, veterans, and advocates who have been doing the actual work. Wiz Buckley has been out there advocating loudly and specifically for veteran access to these treatments, bringing the personal urgency of someone who understands exactly what is at stake. Marcus Luttrell has put his name and his story behind this cause with everything he has got. And for years, this coalition of voices kept pushing against a wall of bureaucratic resistance and legal barriers that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with the political decisions of an administration from more than 5 decades ago. What happened this weekend is the culmination of that push, and the fact that it happened because of a text message, because a president was willing to look at actual data and make a decision based on what the evidence showed rather than what the institutional inertia recommended, is exactly the kind of decisive leadership that this issue has needed for a very long time. But here's what I keep coming back to when I think about the full picture of what just happened this weekend. Marcus Luttrell was standing there. Wiz Buckley was standing there. Joe Rogan was in that conversation at the center of this whole thing. Robert Kennedy was in the room. These are not the usual faces of a Washington policy signing ceremony. These are not career lobbyists or think tank staffers or party operatives who cycled in for a photo opportunity. These are people who have personally lived inside the problem, fought for the solution with everything they had, and put their credibility and their reputation on the line for years to move this issue forward against enormous institutional resistance that was not going to move on its own. The fact that they were all standing there together in that room when the president signed that order tells you something genuinely important about how this moment came to be. It was not delivered by the system. It was dragged out of the system by people who refused to accept that. The answer was always going to be wait longer, study more, convene another panel, submit another request, fill out another form. They found a president willing to look directly at the evidence and make a decision. And that decision is going to save lives, not as a figure of speech or a rhetorical device. Literally. The treatments that this order is unlocking have documented efficacy rates that mean real human beings who would otherwise have died by addiction or by suicide or by the combination of both that takes so many veterans are going to survive because of what was signed this weekend. That is the one simple bottom line. Everything else surrounding this story is context and detail. The bottom line is lives saved. After 20 years of 6,000 veteran suicides every single year, the bottom line has finally changed. That matters more than anything else. And if you have been watching what this country owes to the people who served it, today is worth feeling genuinely hopeful about.